We've heard quite a bit of stuff recently repeated about arms ownership in the founding era. Some fairly significant political figures have made some interesting claims, as you all know.
Fact, and have no negative impact on the Second Amendment. Second Amendment's not absolute. When it was passed, you couldn't own a cannon. You couldn't own certain kinds of weapons. It's just always been limitations. But guess what? These acts.
Of course, the biggest thing we've been hearing recently is the repeated contention that there were limitations on the ownership of arms in the founding era. Something about like not being able to get a cannon or a hand grenade or whatever. Let's start out with a simple truth. There were no real federal armament control laws until the 20th century, so at least on a federal level, these claims are completely false. Still, I think it's valuable to take a closer look at the history of gun control and gun ownership in America. And before we go further, yes, there were several state and local governments that put horrible restrictions on certain people, but that's without the scope of this video right now. To understand American firearms law and culture, we have to understand why Americans regard private firearm possession as the norm rather than as something odd. In other cultures, we can see from very early on, European, Japanese, and other feudal societies absolutely hated the concept of firearm possession by individuals. This is likely because increasing commonality of firearms frustrated the concept of nobility in warfare. With firearms, just about everybody on the field was equal. Firearms ignored fancy, shiny, noble armor and obviated their fancy little cute sword techniques. Effectively, they democratized combat. We saw soon after the introduction of firearms in many of these cultures an aggressive push on the part of the aristocracy to restrict or prevent gun ownership by common people. In contrast, in colonial America, most households were required to possess a firearm for militia and other civil defense purposes. Now, these laws were not really of much effect because the American experience was colored by self-reliance. Firearms were a necessity as tools of survival, both for sustenance and defense. The ubiquity of firearms in American life started immediately given the frontier nature of American settlement. It continued through a bitter war of independence and especially into the expansion west, where Americans carried handguns for protection as a matter of course. Despite our nation's relatively short existence, there is a great deal of recorded history and very distinct times and places that color the American experience with firearms. On that much, it's almost impossible to cover all of the history that explains why we've grown so close to the gun. What we can cover for sure, though, is that we have. So much was our culture of arms ingrained by the time of the Revolution that a 1775 pamphlet warned the British that, in a strong sense of liberty and the use of firearms almost from the cradle, the Americans have vastly the advantage over men of their rank almost everywhere else. Still, though, the contention that you couldn't buy any type of arms you want in the early years of our nation persists. So let's look at some evidence I've found chronologically. In the pre-founding era, a 1746 Massachusetts law forbade private individuals from firing cannons near a certain section of the Boston Harbor. Now, if you couldn't get cannons or you weren't allowed to use them, why on earth would Massachusetts have thought to specify that private individuals not fire them in a certain place? Moving on to September of 1777, Brigadier General Foreman lent to the New Jersey militia his privately owned 3 pieces of field artillery so that it could establish an artillery company. In 1779, amid fear of royal sentiment, Pennsylvania passed a law saying that persons found to be disaffected to independence and liberty should have any cannon, mortar, or ordnance removed from them. A 1789 advertisement promotes the Military Laboratory of Philadelphia, where owners and commanders of armed vessels may be supplied for either the use of small arms or cannon at the shortest notice with every species of military stores. The ad goes on to boast cannon cartridges ready-made to every bore, hand grenades ready-filled and fused, and it further states that anyone there needing, after giving a few days' notice, may be completely furnished with the above and many other articles without further trouble to himself. God, that sounds nice, doesn't it? In 1796, Ira Allen traveled privately to France and purchased 20,000 muskets and 24 pieces of field artillery from the new revolutionary government there so that he could later distribute them to the militia. Suspecting that these would be used in revolt against the British in Canada, the shipment was seized by the Brits while on its way to America, and Allen was dragged to Admiralty Court. At trial, Allen claimed that he intended to distribute the arms across Vermont. The British were skeptical of the idea that one individual would possess 20,000 arms. Allen responded to the skepticism by explaining that, in his state, government have nothing to fear from its militia. Arms and military stores are free merchandise, so that any who have property and choose to sport with it may turn their gardens into parks of artillery and their houses into arsenals without danger to government. Following the trial, the arms, including artillery pieces, were returned to Allen. A 1799 advertisement posted by Mr. Walker boasts for sale 9 and 6-pounder cannons along with accessories, powder, boarding pistols, and cutlasses. Another ad, this one from a June 1813 issue of the Rhode Island Republican, lists for sale a total of 13 cannons, ranging from 4 to 18-pounder, as well as a constant supply of gunpowder, wholesale and retail, ready for immediate sale. Those interested could reach out to Mr. Lyon on State Street in Boston. An 1855 law saw the city of Dayton, Ohio forbid people from firing any cannon within the bounds of the building lots or cemetery grounds or within 100 yards of a public road without authorization. If you violated this law, you could face a fine not exceeding $10. Similarly, in 1859, New York City regulated the firing of firearms, cannons, and fireworks. Illinois in 1876 forbade the discharge of cannons or other explosives on Sundays. Pennsylvania in 1881 made it a misdemeanor to knowingly sell a cannon to somebody under 16 years of age. So apparently there, selling cannons to people over 15 was okay and common enough to be contemplated by law. In 1888, La Crosse, Wisconsin required the permission of the mayor to discharge cannons within the city limits. All this evinces quite handily the common understanding of arms well up to the end of the 19th century. It bears repeating that gun control in a capacity anywhere close to what we suffer today did not exist on the federal level until way into the 20th century. There are a great many people alive today that predate the existence of federal gun control, but anti-rights advocates will insist firmly that this is the way that it's always been. Of course, there were some state and local restrictions on arms ownership, most of which were fueled by a racial animus. Not that y'all didn't already know any of that, I just hope this historical look at private ownership of cannons and the like was at least entertaining for you. Well, that's it for today, guys. As always, I super appreciate y'all watching and subscribing. If you want to support me more than that, I've got a Patreon, a Utreon, and a Subscribe Star where I've got neat benefits for you. This kind of support will help me to make more content more regularly, which is what I really want to be doing. I really enjoy this. There's also a link to merch, including the Magic ATF ball and affiliate links in the description below. Any of this stuff makes a huge help. Remember, when the truth is on your side, you can control the narrative. Y'all take care.